Gopi Jana Balaka Giribharatari Yasodanandana Pratajana Ranjana Yasodanandana Pratajana Amunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Kishore Kishore Ki Jai Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani Ki Jai Gaunitai Ki Jai Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Glorious assembled devotees Glorious assembled devotees Glorious assembled devotees Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya So we're continuing the chapter Brahma's Prayers to Lord Krishna and we are on text, so it's Canto 10, Chapter 14, text 56 and 57. And text 56 is on the board. 57 does not have a purport, but it's interconnected. So you can chant text 56. Vastuto Janatam Akram Krishnam Sasnu Charishnu Cham Bhagavat Rupam Akilam Nanyad Vastavihar Kinchanam Vastuto Janatam Akram Krishnam Sasnu Charishnu Cham Bhagavat Rupam Akilam Nanyad Vastivihar Kinchanam Vastuto Janatam Akram Krishnam Sasnu Charishnu Cham Bhagavat Rupam Akilam Nanyad Vastavihar Kinchanam. Please chant. Vastuto Janatam Akram Krishnam Sasnu Charishnu Cham Bhagavat Rupam Akilam Nanyad Vastivihar Kinchanam Vastuto Janatam Akram Krishnam Stasnu Charishnucha Bhagavat Rupam Akilam Nanyad Vastavika Kinchana Vastuto Janatam Atra Krishna Vastasmi Jadishancha Bhagavat Rupam Akilam Nanyad Vastaviha Kinchana All right. So I'll read the Sanskrit of the next verse and then come back to the word for word. So text 57. Sarvesham api vastinam bhavato bhavati stitaha tasyapi bhagavan Krishna kimatad vasturupyatam. So coming back to the word for word for text 56. Vashtutaha, please repeat. In fact, Janatam, for those who understand, Atra, in this world, Krishnam, Lord Krishna, Stasnu, stationary, Charishnu, moving, Cha, and Bhagavat Rupam, the manifest forms of the personality of Godhead. Akilam, everything. Na, nothing. Anyat, else. Vastu, substance. Iha, here. Kinchana, at all. So the translation and the purport for text 56. Those in this world who understand Lord Krishna as he is, see all things, whether stationary or moving, as manifest forms of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Such enlightened persons recognize no reality apart from the Supreme Lord Krishna. Purport. Everything exists within Lord Krishna, and Lord Krishna exists within everything. Still, the order of progression is always from the energetic to the expanded energy. Lord Krishna is the original identity from whom all other identities emanate. He is the supreme energetic from whom all categories and dimensions of energy become manifest. Thus, our personal bodies, self, family, friends, nation, planet, universe, and so on are all manifestations of the Supreme Lord, who expands himself through his personal potencies. Lord Krishna is certainly the supreme object of our love and attraction, and other objects such as body, family, and home should be secondary objects of our affection. Moreover, a close analytic study of the actual situation will reveal that even the secondary objects of love are also manifestations of Lord Krishna. The conclusion is that Lord Krishna is our only friend and object of love. In his Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Srila Prabhupada comments on this verse as follows. Without being an expansion of Krishna, nothing can be attractive. Whatever is attractive within the cosmic manifestation is due to Krishna. Krishna is therefore the reservoir of all pleasure. The active principle of everything is Krishna, and highly elevated transcendentalists see everything in connection with him. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it is stated that a Mahabhagavat, a highly advanced devotee, sees Krishna as the active principle in all movable and immovable living entities. Therefore, he sees everything within this cosmic manifestation in relation to Krishna. And text 57 translation. The original unmanifested form of material nature is the source of all material things, and the source of even that subtle material nature is the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna. What then could one ascertain to be separate from him? Om Jnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Ramapadaswami Iti Namine. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. I feel like it's a very long time since I've sat here. So, now, this is a continuation of Srila Sukadev Goswami continuing to describe to Maharaj Parikshit that whatever is attractive in this cosmos, the cosmos itself being a manifestation of Krishna, is due to Krishna. So this is how the logic goes. That which draws a person or which seductively seems to offer some reward or pleasure in this whole cosmic manifestation is due to Krishna. So that's the attractive component in everything. It's actually Krishna. And the conclusion, as it's mentioned in this particular purport, which is drawing from Srila Prabhupada writing in Krishna book. Krishna is the reservoir of all pleasure. And there's the simile that just as a lake may store a large quantity of water, so Krishna is that pleasure, or that he's that apparatus, you could say, which holds a large supply of pleasure. So it's akin to the lake holding a huge body of water. So Krishna too, he's that apparatus that's holding a huge amount of pleasure. Now, interestingly enough, Srila Jiva Goswami, when he's writing, he says that the same metaphor, I mean, this was a simile, but he uses it as a metaphor, in relation to Lord Krishna, he uses in relation to Lord Chaitanya. So he says that Lord Chaitanya is 1,000 Ganges filled with the nectar of rare prema directed to Bhagavan, Krishna's lotus feet. So very interesting, expanding that simile into a metaphor that Lord Chaitanya is 1,000 Ganges filled with the nectar of prema, meaning that's love for Lord Krishna. So it's something from the, I guess, from the entity that's experiencing something of that pleasure in relation to Lord Krishna, but at its highest level. So Lord Chaitanya obviously is incarnation of Lord Krishna, but he's manifesting the effects from being in a close mood of loving reciprocation with Lord Krishna, one could say. So the ultimate origin or cause of everything is Krishna. And indeed, to be able to see this may take many, many, many births. And there's an interesting section where there's Srila Prabhupada's looking at different great thinkers and something of how, where they are in this whole progression of being able to understand Krishna as the cause of everything. So, because I deal a lot with a theoretical framework that is based on Aristotelian philosophy when I'm teaching Krishna conscious philosophy or working with children, I actually took a step further and looked at Socrates and how Srila Prabhupada was seeing Socrates, because this is of interest, looking at this whole progression and the many births it may take to come to some understanding of Krishna as being the cause of everything. So there's a devotee who was having a conversation with Srila Prabhupada. The devotee was Shamasundar, and he described Socrates as one who thinks he can arrive at the truth by approaching the subject from every angle mentally until there's nothing left but the truth. So this is quite interesting because Krishna actually explains how you can actually come to the truth. So he puts it this way: after many, many births and deaths, he who is actually in knowledge surrenders unto me, knowing me to be the cause of all causes and all that is. And that's what we're looking at in this particular verse, how it is that one is coming to understand that Krishna is the cause of everything. So Socrates had a particular method, and I'm going to read later on, as we go through the subject matter, a little excerpt of actually Aristotle, since that's closer to where I am, but he applies this method too. You attack a subject from every possible mental angle until you've eliminated, and then you're left with what's the truth. So later on I'll come to it. But when this is being discussed, this particular verse that I read is from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, text 10. I'll read the Sanskrit too, since it's very nice. Bahunam hanmanam ante janavan man pradyate vasudeva sarvamiti samahatma sadurlabha. So it's very rare to actually be able to come to this point to understand that Krishna is the cause of all causes. So, and that actually he's all that there is. So this kind of progression of one could even be executing not even mental exercises, but actually executing transcendental rituals. And still it'll take many, many births to actually become situated or settled, like, yes, you fully understand, you fully realize that Krishna is the ultimate goal of spiritual realization. So it's not a simple matter. And in this progression, the first tendency is towards being impersonal. So one will lean towards impersonalism because one is trying to give up one's attachment to materialism. So it's already a struggle. So it begins, you're trying to get renounced from material things to, elevate the consciousness, but it's easier to be impersonal as you're going through it. So this is a natural progression. And in fact, Srila Prabhupada called Socrates an impersonalist. Or actually, no, it was Shamasundar who labeled Socrates as being an impersonalist. So his mental exercises, so to speak, definitely indicated impersonalism, because he spoke about coming to the absolute good. So not realizing that there's an absolute person, an absolute controller, but rather an absolute good. So impersonal. And now, it's only much later that one will come to an understanding that in order to approach or realize an absolute person, it becomes necessary to take up some activities, some service to that absolute truth, that is complete, perfect person. And as one takes up devotional service, then one, in the progression, one gets a chance to start to become attached to the Supreme Lord. So this is the significant component. There has to be some sort of attachment to the Supreme Lord. And as one's carrying out these activities in devotion to Him, and this is what will allow for that kind of surrender to Him. So before that, it has to be impersonalist. There has to be an impersonalist tendency, because one is still working within the realm of one's own mental powers. And it's only at this time, when some attachment comes to be there for that Supreme Being, that one can understand that Krishna's mercy is everything. One's reliant on Him to have the power to understand. And in this verse, there's mentioned that understanding that He's the cause of all causes, it requires that attachment to Him through performing some service to Him that will permit that. One will also come to have an understanding that He's the cause of this material creation, but yet He's still independent of it. So it's one's attachment to Him that permits this understanding. So it's an interesting, what could one say, an interesting juxtaposition of ideas. That attachment to the Supreme Person permits an understanding that the whole material manifestation comes from Him, but He's separate from it. So it's like truly elevating the consciousness to be able to understand that transcendental truth. It's not an easy thing to comprehend. One realizes, of course, that the world actually is just a perverted reflection of the spiritual world, and one realizes that within everything there's a relationship with Krishna. So it's absolutely necessary to have that connection with the absolute truth, that Supreme Being, and that's a very personalist view. And it only comes after one's worked through a lot of impersonalism. So the universal vision of Krishna, it precipitates one's full surrender to Him. And this is described by Srila Prabhupada as the way in which highly elevated transcendentalists are seeing everything. They see everything in connection with Krishna. So that absolute truth, everything's seen in relation to the absolute truth. Because otherwise one is in this pool of the mental exercises. So one has to, mentally work out things, why this is like this, and then, you're going to get somewhere. And this can be done, but it's many, many births. Now, in this verse in particular, after considering all the objects of love, and that was the whole previous section, such as one's children, one's body, and one's soul, wise persons reach the conclusion that Krishna is the ultimate object of love. So Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he points to the usage of the word, it's there on the board, vastutaha, in truth. So it indicates that finally, those who know Krishna, means those that have become attached to him and have surrendered to him, they have this particular realization of Krishna. So they see him as the cause of all moving and non-moving living entities, because he's the ultimate reality. So also he's the cause of reality. And Srila Prabhupada explains that knowing the Supreme Personality of Godhead means that one knows that he's the source of everything. And of course this takes time, and for those like Socrates, this process of self-searching for knowledge takes time, and in the real pursuit of man is the search for the absolute good, according to him. So he didn't define the absolute good. And Srila Prabhupada, he explains that this is a preliminary understanding of the absolute truth, which is known as Brahman realization, or its realization of the impersonal aspect of Lord Krishna. So it means further advancement has to be there. And one then comes to Paramatma realization, or realization of the localized feature of the Supreme Lord. So this means that God is everywhere. So that understanding comes later even, that God is everywhere. So this is described in the following statement by Lord Brahma himself, and we've just been hearing Lord Brahma coming to all his understanding of Krishna's position. So Lord Brahma, he gets this understanding. He says, this is of Lord Krishna, so the absolute truth. He is an undifferentiated entity. So there's no distinction between potency and the possessor thereof. In his work of creation of millions of worlds, his potency remains inseparable. All the universes exist in him, and he is present in his fullness in every one of the atoms that are scattered throughout the universe at one and the same time. Such is the primeval Lord that I adore. So this is Lord Brahma speaking. So very interesting. I'll read the Sanskrit too. Eko piyasan rachaya vitam jagadananda kotim yak shaktir asti jagat chaya yat anta adantarasta paramam chayantarastam govindam adipurusham tamaham bhajami. So it's a very interesting point that there's actually no difference between the degrees of Krishna's power or strength and himself. So there's a logic here. that Krishna is the creator of all in one sense, and at the same time, he's the same as his creation. I mean, it's quite an idea. So the advanced devotee sees everything within this creation in relation to Lord Krishna. And this is the correct understanding based on this idea that Lord Brahma is presenting, that there's no difference actually between Krishna himself and the degrees of his power or strength. So now this view, it extends to seeing Krishna as being the prime entity within everything as well. So in one's own body, there's the power of speaking, there's the power of hearing, there's the power of mental activities, but these are not important if they're not related to the Supreme Lord. And Srila Prabhupada quotes something from the Chandogya Upanishad, and this is what he quotes: in the body of a living entity, neither the power to speak, nor the power to see, nor the power to hear, nor the power to think is the prime factor. It is life which is the center of all activities. So it's the same idea on a sort of, you could say, microscopic little universe as exists in the broader sphere, that the life within everything is Krishna himself. So this is that progression in advancement of realization that one can actually come to see that. And so it's because Vasudeva, or Lord Krishna, is all-pervading that the devotee surrenders in full knowledge of him. It's because of this factor one comes to actually see that he's present within everything. And such enlightened persons, that's from this verse, recognize no reality apart from the Supreme Lord Krishna. Very interesting. That becomes your reality. You're seeing everything as being connected to him. There's no separate reality. So this is how he himself, his energies are not different, and they say simultaneously one, but you could say you can make a distinction, but they're simultaneously one. So this philosophy that Lord Chaitanya helped to clarify, there's Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. So this way of seeing is by somebody who's truly in full knowledge of the absolute truth. And going along with that is that material desires have fallen away. And the person has become actually devoted to the Supreme Lord or the absolute truth. So by searching after knowledge, one realizes that the self is different from the body. And this was the earlier discussion, to come to that understanding. And when one advances further, he comes to the knowledge of impersonal Brahman and Paramatma. So it takes a long time to actually even understand this concept and reality that Krishna is within everything. It takes a long time, a lot of progression. So here's the example of Aristotle, who's now coming to the impersonal Brahman realization. So he's got an understanding that there's some difference between the self and the material body. He's got that understanding perfectly, and the Greek philosophers do. But the understanding is a lot of impersonalism, and the very mental power, it's not connected to an understanding that that power is connected to the absolute truth, and the ability to use it is coming from the absolute truth. So this is something of how he's discussing. So we began this discussion with how Lord Krishna is the pleasure principle in everything. He's that apparatus that holds all this pleasure. So here's how Aristotle analyzes pleasure. He says, now, just as one science might be the best good, even though some sciences are bad, some pleasure might well be the best good, even though some pleasures are bad. Indeed, presumably, if each state has its unimpeded activities, and happiness is the activity, if the activity is unimpeded of all states or of some of one of them, follows that some unimpeded activity is most choice-worthy. So he's analyzing how you're going to have pleasure and happiness. And it's interesting how he's looking at it. You know, there could be a science that's, you know, there's lots of sciences that are bad. There could be a science that's the most good, you could say. And, you know, there's pleasures that are bad, but there might be a pleasure that is the best good one. And then he analyzes that in any state of pleasure, what would really make it pleasurable is that the activity is unimpeded. And then there's happiness in that activity, because you know it's not going to end. You can keep going. So if the activity is unimpeded, then what follows is that some unimpeded activity is most choice-worthy. So that's the best choice. But pleasure is this, namely, an unimpeded activity. And so some type of pleasure might be the best good, even if most pleasures turn out to be bad without qualification. So through thinking it through, he understands, okay, really, if you're going to choose what's the good pleasure, it has to have an unimpeded activity. That will be pleasurable. And surely it must also be the choice you'll make for that particular activity. It's not impeded in any way. And it also has pleasure in it and happiness. So the happiness has to be there. So this is an analysis where there's impersonalism trying to approach the absolute truth. So he has to, you know, break it down to understand, you know, how do you come to that complete, perfect pleasure that's, you know, uninterrupted. So this is impersonal because he hasn't acknowledged that there's the absolute truth is person who is the reservoir of all pleasure. Pleasure is contained in that absolute truth. So he has to do it through reasoning process. But, you know, you can see that it's approaching the correct understanding. Yeah, this that I've just read comes from a book called Nicomachean Ethics. I had to go through all of this when I was at university. And this is just to teach children philosophy. So anyway, now Krishna's words bring one to the highest state of reality. So you can, in some sense, circumvent all of this and the many, many births if you actually read Bhagavad Gita. So, and this is how Krishna puts it. Of these, meaning he's referring, because the previous verse dealt with the people that do come to him, who do actually come to this point of approaching the absolute truth, wanting to actually hear from the absolute truth, the person. So those are the distressed, person who's distressed, who's trying to acquire wealth, person who's just curious about transcendental knowledge. So that could have been our Socrates or Aristotle coming to that point. And this is how he puts it. Of these, the pious men who begin to render service to Lord Krishna, the one who is in full knowledge and who's always engaged in pure devotional service is the best. For I am very dear to him, and he is very dear to me. This is Bhagavad Gita 7:17. So that person situated in pure knowledge of the transcendence of the absolute truth, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is actually protected through their devotional service, so that actually any material ideas don't enter. So that's what makes his activity unimpeded. So you can see how many births could be circumvented just hearing Krishna speaking himself. So later on in the Bhagavad Gita, there's mention that one will become intelligent and perfect in transcendental knowledge by understanding this philosophy of the Lord and engaging in his transcendental service, free from the contamination of material nature. And you can see, just looking at something of how the Greek philosophers function, that they're very much caught up in material nature because they're having to look at good and bad, even to analyze what's the ultimate good or what's the ultimate absolute truth. They're caught up in material nature. So devotional service allows one to transcend or override and be protected by the transcendental knowledge through service. So it's a very refined state of knowledge, and it doesn't get disturbed because of the protection being provided by Krishna, the Absolute Truth himself. One can always go back and reference. So it's just a lot easier. So anyway, those are some thoughts that came on this particular little 1-2 verses that were there today of seeing that one and only reality. Just some very simple thoughts. If there's any thought on this matter?
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Just to draw a comparison between that nice verse you mentioned about Lord Chaitanya, he's being compared to 1,000 Ganges that are flowing towards the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. And you were comparing the flow of the Ganga to the love that emanates from his heart towards Krishna's feet. And then when you explained this principle of pleasure, that Aristotle was trying to use his mental faculty of logic and reason to somehow derive an understanding of. And you can just see how self-centered the principle is. It's this idea that if I can do something unimpeded, then I will derive pleasure. And that's why the impersonalists can never fully understand the true pleasure principle, which you also mentioned, which is that actually Krishna is the center of pleasure. And so bhakti really kind of challenges our fundamental understandings of, you know, as a human being, if you don't have access to knowledge of Krishna, and all you have is your own faculty of intelligence and experience to deal with, then naturally when we think of happiness, we will think of ourselves in the center of something, right? And then as the recipient of that happiness, but bhakti really challenges that idea, because no, let your desire for happiness flow out of your heart. Let Krishna be the recipient of happiness, and then you'll get unlimited back. So I was recently listening to, this is a very beautiful point that you brought out in your class, and I was listening to a lecture recently that was explaining how the very root of envy is a desire for one's own gratification. Because we move in this world thinking, I should be happy and I should enjoy, then we look at the world and compare ourselves to the world and compare ourselves to others. So naturally, if someone has more than me, then I feel like, well, I'm not getting as much happiness as I should. So I was wondering if you could share a few thoughts on how do we shake our very deep-rooted sense of how we should be the recipients of pleasure, when in fact we should become like you were quoting Lord Chaitanya, where our heart's energy flows towards Krishna. Let Krishna be the recipient of pleasure, you know?
That's very tremendous question. Just taken into account, as you stated, that it's drawing attention to the very self-centered nature of the idea generally persons have of what's pleasure, that it has to give pleasure and happiness to themselves. And so your question, how is it that one actually shakes that idea a little bit so that one is practicing like Lord Chaitanya, that one's love is flowing towards the lotus feet of Lord Krishna? It's a very, very nice question. And indeed, the shake-up is quite something. I'd mentioned through the course of the class that, you know, one can even practice transcendental rituals for many births and not grasp that idea. So I'm very intrigued that you asked this question. Somebody I'm dealing with recently had moved away from the temple and had just briefly come to the temple, has some initiation with some other sampradaya, I don't know. And the person initially was coming here because of some difficulty that happened in that person's life. And the problem got resolved. And so the person's faith got somewhat strengthened. And now time has passed, the person's moved away, they're not in contact with devotees. And I got a call that, you know, another tragedy has struck. And the tragedy that has struck, I was very surprised by the depth of the self-centeredness. I'll describe what it is that I heard. This woman described that she has a 6-month-old child, and the tragedy that has struck is that the husband has now been analyzed to have, or diagnosed to have stomach cancer. And the response was so interesting to hear. The person was saying, what am I going to do? Look at my situation, me alone with my child. And I was struck by the depth of the self-centeredness. I mean, I thought the person's not even understanding the extreme self-centeredness. And so I was thinking about this topic. So your question is very relevant. You know, how do you shake? And this is a person who performs rituals, you know, does fasting for Lord Surya, does worship of Goddess Durga. You know, so there's rituals that are being performed. But the fundamental self-centeredness hasn't shifted, because even those rituals are being performed in order to allow for prosperity, to allow for, you know, the husband to have a good job, to allow for good health. So I was thinking about the topic myself, you know, how on earth does one shake up somebody? And that's your question. And it's not really possible while there is the idea of contentment in this world, or the idea of happiness in this world. So the idea of happiness and pleasure derived through the objects in this world has to actually be put aside. So the idea of happiness and pleasure has to transcend that idea of material objects providing the happiness. Rather, it has to be a transcendent object that is going to be the source of one's happiness, and one also is going to go beyond one's selfish, comfort inducing objects that one surrounds oneself with. It can be one's husband, one's child, one's house, whatever it is. One is actually switching that idea to the idea that, no, actually, the source of my happiness is actually developing devotion for that supreme object. So I'm going to make sacrifices for the pleasure of that supreme object. So that willingness to make sacrifices for the pleasure of the supreme object is actually going to be a new source of happiness. And it's the eternal happiness. So, and you find that most persons will have resistance to making sacrifices for that purpose. I mean, even ourselves, when we add new sacrifices or a little bit more, it's quite an adjustment, because it means you have to, again, make that shift from some self-centered activity. The amount of time one has to zone out or whatever it is, that shrinks in order to make a sacrifice. So it's constantly that you truly have to go past the idea of the comfort and the pleasure that you've arranged for yourself with your material objects. So, and there is arrangement that's made for oneself. One does. In fact, I came across some sentence when I was reading for this particular class where Srila Prabhupada was saying that actually throughout the day we're constantly trying to make arrangements for our pleasure. Constantly. So one realizes that that shift has to go on all the time, in actual fact. So how one views any material object may be material object, but the view may be material. So one has to shift concepts and shift ideas and translate that into new action with new consciousness. So it's an ongoing process, and it requires nurturing that new reality. It's not the reality is now in place and the old reality is out of the picture, not at all. The old reality is there, and one is adjusting and honing and refining. And because of the great kindness on Krishna's part, that merciful aspect, one's consciousness is getting uplifted. So in fact, one's losing a taste for those previous ideas. One now looks back and thinks, oh, that's not pleasurable at all. Now I have no need for that anymore. But it takes time. It takes time, and one refines it. And there's internal work that has to be done, because one may be surrounded by all the same material objects, but how one's looking at them starts shifting because of the internal adjustment of ideas. This child's not for my pleasure. I have, a duty to perform towards this child, and actually I need to raise this child to also have a different reality to what the common reality is. So there's work involved, very subtle work, but work. So it's not that one, sits back and then when some disruption in one's pleasure comes, one's world has fallen apart, which is what I heard. The world has fallen apart. And it's not like that. One has to expect that there's going to be difficulties with that material concept just because of how the world is set up, that nothing lasts long, that you're dealing with entities that have their own ideas, and the ideas may not match yours. The child grows up and actually may not view the parent favorably. So, where's the idea of pleasure then? So there's going to be unhappiness all the way along, somehow or other. But in the other way, coming to the correct reality of by constitution, where one fits into the whole universal scheme of things, then it's the balanced approach, and one is genuinely looking for the upliftment of all those entities around one. So it's such a different kind of concept, and a gradual reality that shapes itself. It's not instant. It's very gradual. So, but the shake-up is an interesting question, and the shake-up is, depends on the person. If you can give the person some transcendental knowledge that, and then whether they apply it, or whether they see how they need to shift their own thinking, that is up to the person. One cannot do that work for someone. So, and that's the difficult part, because as an objective outsider, one sees that, you know, what a suffering condition to look for happiness and pleasure in material objects. But even if one points out the suffering nature of the world, and that, you know, the higher realities where one should repose one's love, and all the change that will cause in the person's life, that's up to the person to take those steps. You can't fully, I mean, you can't do that for somebody else. It's really their own, of their own volition. Yeah. So, of course, maybe if one's very convincing, and if the person is an extremely logical person, then they may be helped a lot, because at least the faculty of reasoning leads one in the right direction. Yeah. So that's just a thought. But I'm so glad you asked the question, because it's been very uppermost in my mind because of this person contacting me. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.